Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again with yet another Build League review video that's pretty big. Usually try and avoid doing these things until the very last minute because they are rather large and daunting to take care of. First of all, let me apologize for the filth that is on my face, aka the mustache. Haven't shaved it off yet. It'll be gone by probably tomorrow. But this is a video where I just look back at the entire league's worth of builds. This time around, I think I had 16. I rate each one individually on certain things, effectiveness, enjoyment, and its kind of budget. Can it be a starter? Don't really take these ratings too seriously. They are just something to kind of gloss over past builds and give them each their own little kind of wrap up and a bit of a review. So with that, let's get started with the first build, which was my starter, and that is Spectral Helix and Spectral Throw Energy Blade Trickster. The idea for this was to try and make an Energy Blade starter, just for kind of making things a bit more difficult on myself, but at the same time there was a new chest that came out that made it look like Energy Blade is going to be quite a bit more budget than usual in this sort of way, and that is Ghost Wrath. So it actually worked out pretty well. I wanted to go primarily Spectral Throw with it, and that's what you see here on screen, and I really wanted to just throw some Energy Blades because it's very pretty with or without the MTX. Here is an MTX on it. And it wanted to be Spectral Throw, but ultimately Helix seemed to perform a bit better off of the low gear I had as a starter. Obviously, starter character, not too much currency going down, and it was very, very budget. I did make it Spectral Throw for quite a long time, but by the time it wanted to start doing like red maps and bosses and all that, Helix was performing just a bit better. Also because I was using a two-hander this time for Energy Blade, just because it scales so much better with the buffs. I was using a two-hander, so your attack speed isn't that great, and both Spectral Throw and Helix really want lots of attack speed, some decent proj speed, reliable crit, all of that. And if your attack speed isn't that great, it might feel a bit lacking from time to time. So eventually swapped entirely into full Helix, and I actually sat on this character for like a week, I think, which is one of the longest I've been on a starter, I think. And it went all the way through to end game, and Spectral Helix is pretty damn satisfying and enjoyable to play, as we all know. It is getting a thick nerf, so probably wouldn't be able to do something like this again unless you were committing to full Spectral Throw. But for an Energy Blade starter, it actually felt pretty damn successful, at least in my opinion. So the effectiveness of it, like, it actually went really high. So it did well. It took on some regular bosses and stuff. I don't think I got to Ubers, can't even remember, but it went from level 1 through to level 95 or some shit pretty damn comfortably, and I'd have to give it an effectiveness of a good 8 or something like that. And the enjoyment overall as well, I mean, considering that it is just another time playing Spectral Throw or Helix, and I've played plenty of them, both of those plenty of times, it's not going to get as high as a rating as you might give if you're playing it for the first time, but it was still very enjoyable to do those things again. The only thing missing was maybe a bit more attack speed, maybe a bit more tankiness. I'd still give it like a 7 for an enjoyment. Compared to some of the other things I did this league, it was fun, but it definitely had a few more levels it could take. And then budget, it was very budget friendly. Can it be a starter? It could have. Last league for Helix, this league, it could probably only really sustain as a Spectral Throw build. And we'll have to give that like a 9 or something for starter viability. And overall, it's a pretty high score. I mean, I didn't want to give it too high a score because it is a very basic build, but that is, I don't know, a 24, I think. The next up is the Reave and BladeFlurry Inquisitor that used Hand of Wisdom in action to stack int and then give lightning damage to the build, and then using those two pretty staple skills from a long time ago that don't really get much love anymore. Reave did receive a substantial enough buff that it, should have been looked at again. BladeFlurry, I don't think anything changed for it, but it's always been good. Just it's not super popular. I've played it a few times in the past year or two, and it's still a very good skill. It just requires a bit more love than maybe some other skills. You really need to fix your area, your attack speed, your damage, and then possibly some survivability. And then BladeFlurry is pretty good. Reave, however, got a pretty substantial buff, and with the amount of area you can get on it now, it's actually pretty filthy. So I did start this character with the intention of getting quite a lot of energy shield and trying to make Hand of Wisdom in action and int stack a thing, thanks to, I think, the new 5-head MTX. That's basically why I did that. And I wanted to be more BladeFlurry than Reave, but in the end, it actually surprised me a lot because Reave came out on top. It just cleared like whole screens quite a bit nicer, and then its single target was very comparable to that of BladeFlurry's, while also being kind of ranged a lot of the time. Especially with the Vile Reave up. You could get your 8 stacks up sometimes against bosses, and then you could just like hit them from the other side of the screen, and your DPS was pretty comparable to BladeFlurry. The only thing that was missing is that I felt the attack speed on this build was a bit lacking. I even tried to get a bit, but I don't think I got enough. So for more smoothness, it still would have been better to get better attack speed, or maybe from a different standpoint of basically not doing Hand of Wisdom in action, because it's just a slow starter for attack speed base, and then also going Inquisitor, which doesn't get much attack speed, really kind of doubles down on the amount of attack speed you can't get. Ultimately, Reave was pretty damn surprising and performed really well, and BladeFlurry is going to get a Vile version this league as well, which looks really good, and prompts me to want to play some more BladeFlurry again this league. But yeah, I think Reave's a pretty good skill at the moment. BladeFlurry should be still a mid-tier skill, but good single target, and then the Vile might take it to another level, so we'll have to wait and see on that. But to give this one some sort of ratings, the effectiveness of it, I can't honestly remember exactly where it was for DPS. Maybe we can see if there's a DPS level there. About 5 million for Reave single target, and I think it would have gone to high roll of like 10 for BladeFlurry, but that's not anything massive for what I would have wanted for endgame. It was kind of thick in the end, and it wasn't super costly, but it can be if you go to the right lengths with int stacking. And then it also utilized some Kalandra unique, not uniques, reflected rares, of course, which won't no longer exist. I think the effectiveness of that is basically a 7. It cleared well, it DPS'd okay, nothing too incredible. The enjoyment of it, I still actually rather enjoyed it, because BladeFlurry is always fun, and then Reave was a surprise package, and it cleared nice with Reave and felt pretty satisfying, but nothing too major. A 7. Can it be a starter? You wouldn't really start it, but you can pretty comfortably do some BladeFlurry Reave early on, and if you're going to make it a starter and morph into Hand of Wisdom in action, it'll take a little bit of work, and you'll be at a low tier of performance until you start investing more. I'm going to give that like a 5. Doable, but not super recommended, and we call that a 19 then. The next build that I did was something I wanted to do for a while, and that was rolling Magma, which was once Magma Orb. This actually ended up, randomly enough, being given Build of the Week once they started doing that again as a series. GGG official thing. It was given Build of the Week even though I wasn't informed about it, and it wouldn't have been the choice of build had I been given the choice to present to them for Build of the Week, but it's not entirely unworthy because it was pretty damn strong, it's fairly cheap, and it had some cool interactions to it, so it kind of makes sense as to why they wanted to go down this route for a Build of the Week, but I had much stronger, funkier builds throughout the league as well. All of that said, rolling Magma, I'm actually pretty surprised at how nice it went down in the end. It does seem like a very strong skill at the moment, pretty slept on, like not many people played it before I was doing this thing for this league and got a bit of a Build of the Week spotlight. It's very strong for how little you have to put into it, especially if you did what I did, which was use the triple damage staff from Searing Exarch. In the end, that's more or less the route that you should be taking as opposed to doing Sire of Shards. So I wanted to do it as a big Sire of Shards molten balls everywhere situation, and that's what you're seeing here right now. And that's what I wanted to do for clear, and then swap over to a single target of just triple damage stuff. So for clear, you're doing a whole rain of shit everywhere, and then for single target, you're doing slow proj little waves of rolling magma. And my conclusion was that you didn't really need to do the Cyrus Shards thing. It was sometimes even a detriment, because on really large open maps like this, Cyrus Shards felt a bit better. It did nerf your damage, but it felt better to have really wide open clear. But then on a lot of maps that were a bit more linear, a bit more closed off, just having projectiles go in a straight line would have been nicer, and to also have more damage. So to have 2 triple damage staffs, one with GMP, one with slow proj, would have probably been a better play in the end, and I could see myself going down a different route in the future to play another rolling magma, maybe an Inquisitor or an Elementalist, and not do anything too funky like a Deadeye with Cyrus Shards. But that said, it was a pretty cheap build. It was kind of different, and as well as that, it took on Uber bosses, first character for the league to do any, I think, and for the amount I invested on it and how simple it was for just a playstyle and all that, it did pretty good for Uber bosses. Like, it could do some serious single target damage. It's a bit annoying having to position your skill to be right at the end of a boss, but that is also a bit more solved with not having to rely onto heavier amounts of chain by not being a Deadeye. So just front loading more of your damage and not caring strictly about the last few hits of your chain. So it went really well, and it also showcased to me how viable Lightning Warp is while you've got good cast speed as a travel skill, so that's something to keep in mind in the future as well. So dead lol. To give it a bit of a rating in the end, effectiveness, it was pretty damn effective. Did everything, killed everything that I threw it at. Few Uber bosses, nothing too major though. I didn't really want to keep going with the Uber farming because it is kind of squishy, it is kind of tough to play against those, but it still has to have, I'm going to give it an 8 instead of a 9 because there are another couple of levels to take in the effectiveness category. Enjoyment, it was pretty damn enjoyable. Like, it's not peak PoE build action, but it's pretty close, especially once you got into a fluid playstyle of Lightning Warp and mix matching your skill and your travel skill. It became pretty damn enjoyable. And can it be a starter? It can. Probably less so as a Deadeye perspective, because you struggle getting damage nodes and defenses early on as a Deadeye, especially without any leveling uniques, but it definitely can be a starter, and I'd encourage starting more as an Inquisitor or an Elementalist. If you want to do some rolling magma, that'll be much smoother. But totally can be a starter, totally can go places. Got to give it a pretty good rating for that as well. Can't even get much better, can it really, as far as starters that go places, so maybe give it a high rating of a 9. And we're talking a rating of 26, which is a pretty good score. Next up, we have the Burning Arrow incident. Now, Burning Arrow is something I wanted to play for quite a while because I really do love the skill, and I've played it in the past when it was a lot better, and it's quite enjoyable. And Vile Burning Arrow is still one of the more satisfying buttons in this game to press. So I tried to go from a bit of a different perspective of scaling fire damage and fizz damage that then converts to fire, and also strength stack. And it wasn't too bad for what it was. Like, the clear on Burning Arrow is still pretty good, pretty satisfying, but the main thing is that at some point Burning Arrow got a attack speed multiplier down to 0.7 from its original of like 100%. So, you know, your 100% attack speed goes down 2.7. At some point that happened, and it's still really noticeable. Like, the one thing for this build to have just felt quite a bit nicer would have probably just been the attack speed being what it should have been. Be running around and right-clicking and zooming quite comfortably. Instead, it's really like, you could really feel that you're just kind of slow sometimes, and then doubling up with the fact that you pretty much have to wear an Asylum and go into the snipe sort of channel damage over time single target thing. Once you do that with such a shit attack speed, your playstyle becomes just kind of crap, for single target especially, because you have to direct a single projectile that channels and eventually hits a payload, and sometimes it's not even a good one, against one boss that doesn't want you to stand still. So I tried my best to avoid going into this snipe situation, and just using like Vile Burning Arrow, and it wasn't really plausible. You did basically have to go into that snipe fiasco just because it's like 2 to 3 times more damage on the high roll, and then that feels bad. So without that, my single target was mediocre at best, but the clear is still really nice. And ultimately, yeah, it's pretty hard to make Burning Arrow scale into a way that kind of makes it worth doing right now. You could just as easily make an Explosive Arrow build instead that will function probably 2 to 3 times better, and allows you to like build for defense a bit more as well. So ultimately, Burning Arrow received some sort of a nerf that it shouldn't have, but it was to like compensate for some other buffs at the time, and it still just isn't too enjoyable or worth building at the moment. That said, you can build it, you can get some enjoyment out of it, but it's pretty low on the value for your time and money invested in PoE at the moment, which is a bit of a shame because it is one of the nicest skills out there at its maximum. So to give that some ratings, we will go effectiveness. It cleared pretty damn well. Single target was whatever, but even for its pretty damn well clear, like almost any other Ignite build that is worth doing is going to be much nicer on the clear. So we have to give that, given its single target like lowness, maybe a 4. The enjoyment, I personally still really enjoyed building the character and then trying to make it work, but the actual enjoyment of hitting this sort of brick wall of I can't do anything else to get it anywhere was kind of low, right? Like, made me feel a bit of despair in the end. I'd have to give that maybe a 5 for enjoyment. And then budget, I mean, low tier Burning Arrows can work for sure, especially as Chieftain, I think some people do that, and they get you somewhere, but at the same time, you'd get so much further doing a budget starter Explosive Arrow instead. So we'd have to give that, like, yeah, it can be a starter, it just has a really low ceiling at the same time. That's maybe a 5. So with that, it's got to be a nice small 14. The next build is a bit of an exercise in what would happen if I actually put some thickness into a character, and my god, is it a pixelated mess. That is largely thanks to the coin showers and all the stuff happening on screen. Either way, it is Poison Shield Crush. So I did want to play a Shield Crush and a Spectral Shield Throw for a couple of leagues again, maybe a league, especially with the new shield that came out, or the unique shield that got revamped, and that is Emperor's Vigilance. I didn't end up playing with Emperor's Vigilance at all, but instead I used one of the new revamped uniques, which was Ming's Heart. So it gave you a lot of extra chaos damage over your fizz, and instead I then built with just a large armor shield and went a Pathfinder with some prolif, which meant I didn't really have to focus on any sort of clear or like AoE for Shield Crush. It just hit in a small area and then prolift to everything. It ended up having some really good single target damage as well, and on top of that, given that I had Pathfinder starter and then sort of a melee that could get Fortify, and you wear a really thick shield, I thought I'll try and lean into this thickness aspect of a build, and I made it pretty damn thick. So in the end it had, yeah, like lots of reduction to armor, lots of evasion. It was built kind of like a champion would be, with Fortify, Cat Spell Suppress, and it was probably one of the thickest characters I'd made in recent memories. And it still had decent single target DPS. It was actually the first time I think I remember doing uber boss fights from a lower DPS perspective, but one that could take lots of hits and thus do lots of mechanics on these boss fights. So it really did highlight to me that that's not how I want to play the game, because it's just a bit too slow. Like, this was I think, Eater of Worlds where I did it deathless, and I could take lots of hits, and I could deal out some punishment, but at the same time, it also showed that melee is at a big disadvantage on Uber bosses. Prior to Uber bosses, like melee and being this melee on a build and a character, doesn't feel that bad. It's not really noticeable, and DPS is really good against regular pinnacles. Once you start getting to the Uber level and you've got to constantly dodge things and try and get back in range, and yeah, we can take lots of hits, but because I don't have an overkill of damage, I can't just like blast through the boss. It, yeah, made me not love the Uber fights and not love the melee situation I was in. And this is basically how you would build a hardcore style character typically for these bosses, something that can take lots of damage, lots of punishment, but then has a little bit of damage to throw out of its own. In the end, I think it was a really successful build for poison and for shield crush and for thickness, but given the choice, I'd probably rather build with far more damage in the future. That said, yeah, really good build. I think it was one of the better builds for the league, just not going to compete with the really big DPS ones that were quite a bit more special in their own right. This is basically just a poison Pathfinder, but as a shield crush instead, and it worked really well. Effectiveness, got to give that a 9. Didn't have billions of damage, but it, on the same time, could back up its decent damage with really good survivability and tankiness. The enjoyment of it, a pretty high level of enjoyment. Poison Prolif is just one of the most satisfying things in PoE, and we got lots of that out of the build, but then it's a melee against Ubers, and that really rains on your parade, but could still do them. And then the budget, it can be pretty damn budget, it can be pretty damn starter friendly. Shield Crush at various different ways of building and levels is very much a starter and can be gone from level 1. This one, if you're going poison, you might want to go Poisonous Concoction to begin with because it scales a bit better earlier on, but once you start getting shields and you've got the currency to be able to craft a couple of whatever shields or get some unique ones, then it starts to take off. Can it be a starter? I think it's pretty damn starter friendly. Give that a nice solid 8 as well, which puts us at 25 as a total, I believe. Next up, we have Sunder Hollow Palm as a champion. Now, I've been meaning to make a Hollow Palm build for a little while, and Sunder build as well, and it did get a buff this time around, so it was just a bit faster to travel with. And honestly, it felt pretty damn good playing Sunder for the first time in a while, and as a skill, it's pretty damn solid. It's got good DPS, it clears well, and then Hollow Palm itself scaled really nicely, especially as a champion with Impale. It's not what I would have thought is going to be the best sort of Sunder, but it's definitely a viable one, and Champion let us go a bit thicker once again on a character, and it was similar in thickness to the Pathfinder, maybe a little less so, given that I can't really sustain flasks as well. I've got slightly lower life pool, and DPS I think was a bit more questionable. Its clear was still very meaty, especially because once you overlap lots of enemies and the shockwaves go off, then it just has this sort of cascading explosion effect. So for blights, for example, you can just basically off-screen with your melee build, and it was a pretty successful Sunder buff slash rework for what it was, I think, anyway. I played it from level 12 all the way onwards, and it gets a bit faster, but the take-home message is that it definitely is fast enough to feel good enough to play all the way through the game, and you can only really have one Sunder out at a time, so if you want to attack faster and faster, you need to be a bit closer to the enemy, but with the way that it travels at this speed, you don't have to be super close like you did before, when you had to be basically point blank to the enemy. Ultimately, could easily see myself playing another Sunder build and going from a different perspective, maybe like a chieftain or some shit. Hollow Palm once again reminded me why I still don't currently love Hollow Palm, and that is the absolute lack of sockets in the build. You are by default losing both weapons and gloves, and it's pretty uncomfortable to have to make decisions between what auras and what skill gems that you still are allowed to fit into the build. But Sunder itself and Holy Palm both proved to be still very viable choices, and then more Sunder builds in the future, I think. Maybe not so many Holy Palms, just because it's not super comfortable compared to some other build choices. But it was also the first time I did Dancing Dervish, and it's a reworked one, and it's pretty damn useful in the Hollow Palm situation to make yourself quite a lot faster, since you can sustain rampage stacks on actual bosses now. So decent single target, decent thickness, really nice clear. Overall, a pretty damn good build, and it was surprisingly enjoyable. I didn't think I'd enjoy it as much as I did, but it worked quite nicely. So effectiveness, it went just about all the way to do almost everything. I think it did kill some Ubers. Could have used a bit more DPS if you really wanted to do Uber single target, but it was definitely enough, and for everything else in the game, pretty damn good. The enjoyment of it, I'd give that a pretty high rating as well. I think it's going to ultimately be similar to the Shield Crush build, because it did feel quite similar. They're both kind of melee builds. One's a bit more range than the other one, but still scaling melee, around the same level of thickness. Can it be a starter? It's a bit harder to make this a starter since Holy Palm isn't something you just immediately get, but there's nothing super expensive about the build, and you're already taking 3 pieces of gear away from the character to begin with, so that's less to focus on, but it does sometimes mean that the other pieces of gear have to be a bit stronger. I'd say you can make it into a starter, just go Sunder until you can get like Hollow Palm, or maybe even Face Breakers until you can get Hollow Palm. I'd say we still give it something like a 6, because it's not, in its purest sense, doable immediately. And that makes it a slightly lower score, but still a pretty good one of 23. The next build is somewhat of a surprise package for me, because I know bow cast on crit is always a winner, always something pretty strong, and always a bundle of fun. But even that said, this one, with what I ended up doing for it, kind of surprised me how smooth it could have been using the Lightning Warp, and surprised me how much goddamn fun a bowcock really can be. And it would get build of the league even, and it was absolutely, unequivocally gonna get build of the league. But I do think that the build coming up a bit later in Shockwave Totems was just overall a slightly better package, and that's gonna have to take it. So this one's gonna be a close second for build of the league, in my opinion, but I could easily see how other people could say this is probably the best build I've ever made. And bow cast on crit with Arc and Lightning Conduit are the damage spells, and then we slotted in Lightning Warp on the Asenath's Hat, I think it was, so that every single time you attack, you Lightning Warp over to where you're attacking. Ended up basically being what I called CoCBow Flicker Strike. It was just so much fun to play that I kept playing it for much longer than I would normally play a build. Got to like 96, and the real nice thing about it is that with just a little bit of a swap into Blast Rain, you could also have insane single target. Now, a lot of the strength of this build basically relied upon the fact that Lightning Conduit is a bit overtuned, and it's getting nerfed this league. It's still going to be a viable build, don't get me wrong, but it was overtuned, and it was kind of going to be a no-lose situation where you just can't really have low damage with Lightning Conduit if you're going to build it in a normal sort of way. But the fact that Lightning Warp was moving so smooth and so comfortably without stacking too much less duration meant that it was such a fast build at the high end, and still so effective thanks to the Inquisitor ignoring resists against all the Arch Nemesis bullshit that the game still had. And then Arc cleared really well. And it was defensively not too shabby, even though we're porting all over the place and not super high on the defenses. It was just a high tier meme of a build that was one of the most enjoyable Path of Exile experiences I've had in, a good couple of years or some shit, because of how kind of different it was to anything I'd played before. It was pretty much as close to Headhunter gaming as I'd had as well, maybe ever. And for that, it's also a bit too much because I don't love that sort of keep going faster and faster and doing dumber and dumber things, but it was still somewhat controllable in what it was doing. And this is just an example of like a really high tier map so that, you know, you're not just avoiding dumb maps and you can do all kinds of shit. And the bossing in the end is essentially taking away the lightning warp because it was just silly to be lightning warping on bosses. So you take away lightning warp, put in blast rain. Blast rain procs your cast on crit a lot better, and you're a little bit more fish out of water, like movement speed and all of that wise, but it doesn't really matter because it's got so much damage that you just obliterate whatever boss. I think it took on all Ubers, and it could do most of them pretty reliably. Some of them a bit, you know, questionable, but yeah, very, very close to Builder League, and probably should have been had I not played one that took the cake just a little bit more. So to give it some ratings, effectiveness, it's a 10 because clear, insane. Bossing, pretty damn insane. You know, you really can't get much better. Enjoyment, that's a 10. Had huge amounts of fun on it. Fun for clearing, fun for bossing, fun to put together. Budget, can it be a starter? I mean, no, not really, but building into it as a good build shouldn't be too hard. You need an Asenath, you need a shaped bow, and a bit of established currency to make a good cast on crit bow, which is very reliable and not too hard to do, and then fine tune some gear, and it's pretty good. Unfortunately, we did get a bit of a nerf. I'm still going to call it like a 7 for a starter. It's fully doable to build just a spell sort of starting build and then transition into this eventually, and it definitely deserves a high rating, so give it a 27 total. And actually, as a bit of an amendment, it didn't even use a shaped cast on crit bow in the end. You typically do want to for cast on crit bow builds, and we probably maybe even should have, but I did do a tri-elemental bow for the Inquisitor Battle Mage thing, which means you can basically do almost any spell in there, and the nerf to Lightning Conduit isn't even as big for this type of build as we would have thought. So I think that deserves a slightly higher rating to make it an 8 for a starter, and a budget for the 8 there, and a total in the end of 28. It's a bit more realistic as a overall package that way, but bear in mind going a shaped bow route might still be better. Either way, very viable on the low end of gear, and then it scales really high if you keep investing into it. We then went into Cleave. So Cleave is a build that I did, I don't know, not too long ago, and it was kind of mediocre, but it kind of worked. That said, we got a +2 radius buff for our Cleaves. See if we can get slightly better something. Now the quality on this is just going to be shit regardless, eh? The +2 radius was just a huge meme in the community because they basically gave a lot of skills almost no sort of buff, but Cleave got a +2 radius, which meant huge viability. And I thought I'd still put that to the test, and it was actually slightly noticeable. Having the +2 radius and then still scaling lots of area meant that Cleave could get some pretty respectable area. Its main problem is still that it doesn't scale super well on single target, and it's a bit of a basic skill from 10 years ago that just needed some more love than this. And it's getting that in the form of Varl Cleave this time around, so that makes it, the area substantially better, and then also gives it like a Headhunter-like property. It is a Voidforge based build though, which is getting a huge buff and most likely going to be one of the rarer items out there. If you can get yourself a Voidforge, then yeah, holy shit, it's going to be a very substantially buffed build. But seems unlikely, and you might not want to waste a Voidforge on a Cleave build. So overall, it was still pretty playable, and for a melee build, it performed well enough. It was pretty fun, but still feels a bit lacking, and you know, like it could do more, or like you could be doing more with your Voidforge. And Cleave is still a bit it's a bit of an old skill. It's Cleave. So effectiveness, give it like a 7. Cleared alright, it did bosses alright, but really nothing special. The enjoyment, I mean, that's going to be probably a 7. Nice memes that I was playing Cleave, bit of extra radius and all that, but didn't really love playing it any more than most other normal builds, and it wasn't unenjoyable, so it's got to be about a 7. Budget can't really be a starter, but you can definitely try some sort of Cleave starters and then be disappointed by their output by the time you get to like high tier maps, because you're going to want some currency, some gear to make it go somewhere. Probably give that a 6. It's not unfair to get this to about a 20 out of 30, which, yeah, kind of a mediocre build, you know. Next build I messed around with was a pretty zoomer build, and it was my attempt at a Cospris Malice build. It was also trying to attempt to use something as a trigger for melee cast on crit that I hadn't done before and I hadn't seen done before, which is Blade Storm. Originally I wanted it to be like Lancing Steel, and then Lancing Steel with Ice Spear just going off would be really cool, but you can't Lancing Steel with Cospris because it's not a melee skill. So I tried to use Blade Storm because I figured you could still project forward sort of this AoE thing and then get procs from more of a distance. And it did kind of work out. It was a bit uncomfortable at times, and it still didn't really travel forward as kind of you'd like it to. You certainly needed to fix attack speed and crit strike chance quite profusely before it started to feel quite good as well. Ultimately, you can then instead just do Cyclone, as it's still the king of melee cast on crit proc rates, but I stuck to Bladestorm, and in some cases on some bosses it was actually still better, just because you don't have to be in full melee range. You can sit back a bit, throw out your Bladestorm, and get some pretty good proc rates happening without being in pure melee range, whereas the Cyclone variants really force you to be super up close and personal with the boss and make sure you have either billions of damage or enough survivability to take a few hits, and that's really the case over here. So it wasn't the best build in the end, but it cleared rather nice. It was a bit different, and it was pretty fun. But its effectiveness on the Cospris scale for builds probably isn't super high. I think I've seen some really big examples out there, and mine was just okay, but it was trying to be a Scion, it was trying to be a bit hipster, and it achieved what it set out to do well enough. And yep, some big loot explosions there. So its main falling off was I don't think it had enough single target damage for what I thought it should have, but it did take on some Ubers and it cleared most things in the game not too poorly. I just think it should have had more damage, and for whatever reason it was just still lacking a bit, whether I did something wrong there or didn't build it well enough or didn't go hard enough on currency. It underperformed my expectations by a bit, but Bladestorm was a viable enough trigger, and I was happy with that outcome overall. So for the ratings for this build, effectiveness, it cleared alright, it bossed alright. I have to give it an 8, mostly because the clear was pretty good, the bossing was okay, but it wasn't really particularly bad at anything there. The enjoyment of it, I have to give that a 7. I've certainly had more enjoyment. It kind of felt on par with, yeah, Cleave even. Just another cast on crit build that didn't do anything too special. Compare it to cast on crit build that really blew out my expectations of what fun could be and what skills could be. Yeah, maybe about a 7. And then budget, it can't be too cheap. It's not too expensive. Cospris usually pretty easy to get with just a bit of work, and then fine-tuning you get around it isn't super tough, but on the high end of this sort of gear, it can definitely go a lot higher, and it's something I didn't really achieve, and it's something you probably wouldn't come close to achieving anywhere near the first week or two. I think I also used Badge of the Brotherhood in this character. I'd give it something like a 5, which as a total is something like a 20 still, which is about right. Wasn't great, wasn't terrible. The next build, what can I say, is the one I was talking about just earlier, of build of the league, possibly build of the life, who knows. Shockwave totems, man was it juicy. So we're giving it build of the league, even though I thought I already had a build of the league locked down, simply because it just was so effective. Shockwave totems. Who'd have thought? No one. No one would have thought. Not a single person. And it doesn't take too much to get going. But basically, Astral Projector is a ring that gets you to get your Shockwave totems to do far more than they normally would. So Shockwave totems have a sort of AoE around them that they pulsate with, but if you use an Astral Projector, it turns that AoE into a ranged sort of AoE projectile. We wouldn't call it a projectile, but into a ranged AoE, and it means that your damage is basically at pretty close to 100% effectiveness always. So we went ahead and cleared all content in the game on this build and did it several times just because it was that smooth and that easy. The build also actually cleared really nicely too. I was surprised at how well a totem build like this one could do maps. So just with enough totem placement speed and a bit of speed on your own end, you place some totems and it could off-screen, screen wide clear constantly, and even without super amounts of thickness, I wasn't squishy, but without huge thickness, pretty much never die, just because as soon as you place a totem and scale enough attack speed, cast speed, sorry, it would instantly kill everything on screen. So it was really reliable for safety, it was really reliable for clear, and then ultimately the boss damage that it was doing was fairly unreal. Also did that, I suppose. But it was fairly unreal. And it could also hit multiple targets at once. So if they're stacked up together, they get obliterated together. If they're separate, then some totems are going to take care of some stuff. But it was deleting regular bosses just completely insanely. And it has to have Builder League because it was so surprising as to how much damage it could truly do. When we thought it would do pretty good, sure, but this level of good was just unprecedented. And it can probably even go deeper if you didn't do Hierophant potentially as an Inquisitor and maybe some other sort of scaling with Heat Shiver, etc. But the main thing is that its 30 million DPS or so is reliable DPS. It's basically up all of the time, and it's not ever really paper DPS. As long as your totems are down, and they pretty much always are, then you are getting all the bang for your buck. And that's why it's getting Builder League, and that's why it was one of the probably best builds ever played in modern Path of Exile. And yeah, it's pretty scuffed viewing, but that'll do it. That's a large build. So the effectiveness on it, it's a 10. The enjoyment, thanks to that effectiveness, has to be a 10. Can it be a starter? It actually kind of can. Without an Astral Projector, it sucks a little bit against some endgame, but you can easily play it without the Astral Projector for a long time. And I'm going to even test it as a starter for the next few days just to see how well or how bad it starts out with absolutely zero gear. But I think it absolutely can be. I know people have been doing Shockwave totems as starters for a little while. It's just not a very popular skill, and it hasn't had a lot of eyes on it up till now. So for it, can it be a starter? It's probably an 8. It feels a bit bad without Astral Projector, but that doesn't mean it doesn't perform and doesn't work well. So give it a pretty high score of a 28. We then go from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows, which isn't entirely true. It actually wasn't that bad of a build, but it's Strike Melee, which, you know, no one is too happy with at the moment, it seems. Infernal Blow Witch. Personally, I actually really liked the build playstyle. The aesthetic for the Witch, of course, holding that two-hand sword, just one of the nicest looking characters I've had for the league. And it was a decent build. As always, Infernal Blow, you'd imagine the lacking part of the build is basically single target. So you're a melee build, but with enough strike range, you can kind of get away with being less melee. Ultimately, though, it just doesn't have the best single target damage. So then you're stuck being a melee build that can certainly take some damage and do some dying on uber bosses and shit like that. If you forget the existence of uber bosses, which is what I think this build was supposed to be doing, then it performs pretty well across the board. It kills regular bosses well enough. but its main purpose is certainly to clear. If you include uber bosses, holy fucking pain champ. Essentially, yeah, strike skill with not enough damage or not enough defense means that you're in for a bad time. That said, I wasn't really trying to take on Ubers with this. I was just trying to have an enjoyable experience playing Infernal Blow, and also trying to take it to a hipster variant, which was using Frostferno and going lots of initial cold damage and then converting some to fire through like Infernal Blow and some additional fire through the Frostferno itself, which ended up being an okay success. Yeah, it was just good for what it was supposed to be, but then it couldn't go any further than what it potentially ever had any chance to, or something. Don't even know what I'm really trying to say there. It did all it really could, basically, which is what I expected of it. So I knew it wasn't going to be a large build, and I knew it wasn't going to take on the entire universe smoothly, but with the right strike range, with some extra strikes, with Infernal Blow and Ice, Herald of Ice popping off, it was satisfying enough and it was fun enough, but it wasn't something I really did too much recommending of to other people. Maybe that makes sense. Infernal Blow is still a very satisfying skill, but still not the highest on effectiveness. As you can see, it clears just satisfyingly. And then single target makes you feel kind of bad, which is never something you really want in PoE, to have a build that does too much of one thing and not enough of another. But yeah, that's just what it was. Single target, not too bad against things that don't fight back all too profusely. So effectiveness, about a 7, cleared well, bossed okay, and enjoyment, probably about also a 7. It's going to be one of those. And then a budget, can it be a starter? As an Elementalist, Infernal Blow, Elementalist as a melee sort of thing is really tough to be a starter, because you need established gear, you need level uniques, you need all of that, and you need some pretty good gear to make it a build. So in the end, it can't really be a starter. I'd have to give that like a 3, and it's a total of 17. Next up we have probably the best example of a Kinetic Bolt I've seen personally, or like made myself for sure. And that is, yep, Kinetic Bolt Deadeye using some alt quality stacking. So I've tried that once before a long time ago, but there's far more avenues for alt qual stacking right now, and also for extra cast speed. You can see we got with an Echoing Shrine and Accelerate Shrine to the level of attack speed that your character gets animation locked. But thanks to Kalandra jewelry being able to get way more cast speed than you previously could before, and then also Diala's chest that got buffed to do way more quality, I tried to go all out for cast speed on this build and alt qual Kinetic Bolt stacking. And it was actually the first time I'd ever seen Kinetic Bolt do any single target damage. So previously I thought it would, I played it, I tried it, and I thought, yep, that can do some alright clear. It's kind of a meme, and the single target was just weird and wonky. This version, with the right scaling and all of that, actually got to pretty high DPS, about 20 million DPS, and it killed, I think, most Uber bosses and destroyed regular sort of Guardians and bosses, and it was actually quite surprising for what it was. But the main problem was I made it pretty damn squishy, just lots of evasion, because this was a character that I tried to go aura stacking on, like quite heavily for the first sort of time for damage. So I used Wrath, I used Anger, I used Empower and plus level boots for them, and then also stacked a lot of evasion through Grace. The life was pretty damn low, so it was one of those, don't get hit sort of situations, but it was fast, it killed things quick, so you still didn't die too often on it, with all that said. It was a bit of a screen cancer build, depending on whether or not you like seeing this sort of a zigzag bright thing, but it cleared really well, it played really well, and it surprised me on single target damage. As we can see right around here, it killed a boss and you could definitely feel the 20 million DPS. So give that some nice juicy ratings. It was pretty damn effective. Give that a 9 because it cleared insane. It bossed pretty damn well. Not the best, but pretty damn well. Enjoyment, an 8. It was a bit messy once you started getting a lot of attack speed and screen cancer. So, you know, it's not really what you're looking for in a build a lot of the time. Do want some better visibility and stuff. The budget, can it be a starter? No, not really. For this, you need alt quality KB, you need a Dialas, you need all the right cast speed gear, you need a good wand, you need the right stacking. It'd be tough to pull this off as any sort of a starter. If you wanted to start Kinetic Bolt and Deadeye, you certainly could, but you wouldn't be ramping into this sort of version for quite a long time. So maybe like a 3 based off of that, which still levels us off at 20. Next up, we have a build and a skill I've played a few times, but it has seen much more use in recent times, and holy hell is the bitrate terrible with this sort of action. It's Venom Gyre, and it, like I said, I have played it in the past, but it seems to have gotten quite a bit more meta since, and going into a stacking of projectiles that then you catch and then whirl through enemies seems to be more of the meta for it, and that turns it into one of the best clear skills out there, I think. Simply because you shoot out a lot of projectiles, and then when you're on the move with your whirling, you are doing a lot of extra clear as well. And with Awakened Fork or Awakened Chain and a chain sort of base, it can definitely clear pretty much harder than almost anything else out there. It's just an absolute nutty mess. And then what you're getting this patch this time around is Vile Venom Gyre, so it's going to become even better for clear, I think. Not sure what that's going to do to single target, but it looks like it should ramp it by a little bit. This character I tried to build with a strength-based claw because it was a synthesis base, so there weren't too many out there, but they were pretty cheap. And went strength stack and pure fire damage. So it ended up having really good single target. I built it pretty damn thick because strength stack means a lot of life, but then it could also have insane clear for a skill of this nature. It will get slightly worse thanks to the Nightblade nerf of removing Withering Step as an option to refresh your elusive, but not too much worse. I think that's not that mandatory in these Nightblade builds. It will just mean that your high-end potential is a bit lower for certain fights, but overall I think it still works well enough. Let's try to see right now. Like right now, in this fight, I didn't even refresh my elusive until 90%, just because I don't always left-click to move when I'm moving around and stuff. But it will be a slightly noticeable decrease, I think. Either way, Venom Gyre should get better at this stage thanks to Vile Venom Gyre, possibly worse thanks to Nightblade nerf. But it was one of the most enjoyable clears for a skill I've had, you know, this league and in a few past leagues. Very strong overall effectiveness. It's close to being built of the league with the others as well. Overall, it's an effectiveness of 10, I think. Not our best single target, but still pretty damn good. And overall, it's clear. Has to elevate it above some other things. Probably a 9 for enjoyment, because loved playing it. Wanted to play more of it. Played lots of it. And then the budget. The way I built it with the Fire Claw basically can't be done early on or a budget at all. But Venom Gyre itself, as it's like a Pathfinder, just poison. Very accessible, very doable early on, so for that I'd start to give it something like a 6, so a 25 total. We then move into Energy Blade Rage Vortex. Now this is a build I wanted to do strictly because Energy Blade has a really cool micro, and throwing forward your weapon with a Rage Vortex makes it spin uncontrollably and look ridiculous. I've played Rage Vortex once before. It is a very strong skill, but it's not really my cup of tea for a playstyle. You kind of have to like wait for the rage to build up for maximum sometimes, and you can only have one Rage Vortex out at a time, which makes the clear a bit clumsy in my opinion. But I wanted to use the gloves to scale my Rage Vortex as well. My Rage didn't manage to do that, the new Combs gloves. And instead just went Chainbreaker and then an Inquisitor base with a very weird way of scaling your energy shield and rage vortex sort of thing. So it's int stack, strength stack, and going all over the tree. So it's something I hadn't typically done as like a build style before, so it was very new to me, kind of different, and received outside help to be able to do it. Ended up being a very good build, but still had all the problems of Rage Vortex for mapping, where I didn't love it, one Rage Vortex out at a time. Feels a bit weird, but the DPS on it was really good, the thickness on it was pretty good, so it was overall a very effective character and quite hipster. So I have to, you know, give it lots of props for doing what it did, but still don't really enjoy like the mapping aspect of Rage Vortex, though I understand that some people really do. But you can tell that DPS on it was pretty damn high. I can't remember exactly how high it went, like 20-30 million or some shit. It's got a lot of high rolls and stuff, and it was one of the highest single target DPS for the league by a good margin. There weren't many that came close. It would have been like Shockwave Totems, yeah, and maybe the Bow Cock. But this one had a bit more setup, and if you died and then had to come back into a boss fight, it's pretty tough to catch up with your setup. But thanks to the large amount of damage from Energy Blade, Rage Vortex being very strong, you could just pull out some pretty filthy DPS. So it was a very strong build overall. Not my favorite to play, but definitely a good example of some Energy Blade action, and easily the most powerful Energy Blade build I've made thus far. So for that, it's definitely got to get some extra street cred, I think. Effectiveness, it's got to be a 9 because it has insane single target. It clears okay. I just don't love the clear, and you know, for that it's a bit lackluster. But its effectiveness overall, it does everything really well. So I can't fault it for that. The enjoyment of it was still fairly high, maybe still a 7, because like I said, didn't love doing the clear, having to wait one vortex at a time, but the novelty of the Energy Blade, the novelty of the huge single target was pretty high. And budget, it honestly wasn't that expensive, because essentially we used some cheap items in the build, some easy to get items, but a couple of the items were fairly expensive. To get it up and rolling and like working, it's not going to be too hard. So I'd still give it something like a 5. It's not too hard to get up and rolling, but to make it a decent build, you need a few of the key pieces, which aren't necessarily expensive, but aren't necessarily easy to get. Chainbreaker, maybe all the right stats to get it scaling, shaper gloves. Ultimately, that leaves it at, I think, 21. We then have, I think, the first real mine build attempt I've had, aside from Zombie Mine Explode, which is a bit weird. Doesn't really count, I don't think. And it is Frostbolt Mines. So once again, this is an alt quality stacking build, but taken from a slightly different perspective, and I'm using Ashes of the Stars in this one because I was allowing myself, for a particularly hipster build, to do a little bit more budget spending. And the alt quality here makes the Frostbolts return. So with enough quality, most of your Frostbolts are going to return to you, and it causes quite a lot of screen cancer once again. That has been a bit of a running theme for this league, lots and lots of screen cancer, but I was actually surprised at how effective the build was in the end. So the only real issue is the mine playstyle. It's not going to be for everyone. It wasn't for me. It is smooth and it is good, but it's not super enjoyable in my opinion to like have to constantly throw out a lot of mines and stutter step, click, all of that. But it was a pretty big novelty for how crazy the build was, sending out lots of Frostbolts everywhere and being able to pre-fire some bosses, freeze some bosses here or there, and single target was pretty damn respectable. And the clear, for what it was, with mines and some slower traveling bolts and kind of a squish character, but given that it's a mine playstyle, still went well. The clear was pretty damn good. Overall, it was close to build of the league as well. If I didn't have those two other really standout builds, this one may have actually taken the cake, because it could comfortably kill most bosses and had really good pre-fire potential on a lot of bosses, and it could clear really well, and it was a big novelty. Just the amount of balls going everywhere and the screen cancer and how pretty it was at times, it was definitely enough of a novelty to come close to a build of the league. So it gets some pretty good ratings, I think. Effectiveness, it's a 9. It needed a bit more single target for pure effectiveness. The enjoyment of it was a 10 because, man, was it fun watching like the balls go everywhere. It was a bit mesmerizing at times, and I played it for a long time. For a mine build, it went pretty deep on playtime on my standard of characters. And then can it be a starter? I think you can start Frostbolt Mines, and if you don't love that, Ice Spear Mines, Freezing Pulse Mines, Winter Mines, and then transition into this sort of thing. But to get it to the level where you've got alt quality and, you know, and ashes or some shit, that's pretty far away. But it can definitely be a start. You can definitely play some mine characters like this, so it still gets a decent rating for that. Overall, give it a 25. And then lastly, we have a build that took me like a month to post and finish because of so many events that were happening and playing some other games and shit. And that is Explosive Arrow Hit Base. So as we all know, Explosive Arrow as an Ignite version and as a Totem version, pretty meta and fairly well played. I wanted to take it in a different direction and play it as a crit hit base with lots of attack speed, lots of fuse charges, lots of explosions, and it worked out pretty damn well. As you can see, it is essentially the Michael Bay movie of builds, where with the right MTX, using the Pandemonium Explosive Arrow and the Despair Herald of Ash, it becomes kind of a thing of beauty. I really enjoyed actually watching the build and playing through it because of that, even if it's not really to my taste, because I tried to build it as fast as possible, lots of haste, lots of movement and attack speed, and it gets you into this cycle of trying to go faster and faster, and for me that's too fast. It's not really how I like to enjoy my PoEs, but it's a huge novelty having this sort of explosive power and this sort of speed, and as a one-off every now and again, it's pretty cool to have. The main issue is the single target was a bit lower than I would have liked. For what I tried to do, I thought I could go higher on single target, and it still did decent, but it wasn't right where I wanted it to be. Like, if it was more comparable to the Kinetic Bolt character, I would have been happy, but it's maybe about half of what the Kinetic Bolt character was doing, and at the same time, to do that single target, you have to stand very still, almost channeling a skill with the barrage nature of our explosive arrow, and then you got to stand still, just pinpointing where your single target's going to go. So it could do some alright single target, but you feel a bit vulnerable during it, and you've also got to do a couple of gem swaps here or there. There's probably about 10 million single target compared to the other build, which is like 20 mil. It's noticeable, and it's also a bit uncomfortable thanks to having a very narrow direction for which you're attacking in, and also needing to be ranged with far shot to get the most out of your damage. Still a very enjoyable build, and I do think Explosive Arrow has some serious potential as a hit base instead of a crit base, and it was using a Qual Rain, which I don't think I've used in a build in a long time, so it was pretty nice to be able to utilize some cheap and easily accessible uniques. Took on a couple Ubers and probably could do more, but it's not super comfortable having like almost no life against these things and a certain playstyle. But being very fast made it that dodging various mechanics was so much easier than many other characters, and for that I did kind of enjoy that as well. But to be giving it some rating action at this point, effectiveness for clear, pretty insane. I could speed clear maps very quickly, huge XP per hour, just don't get hit. Yep. For single target, kind of okay. Have to give it like an 8 for that overall. The enjoyment was pretty high. Would have enjoyed it with a bit more single target, but can't complain. Like, I really did enjoy playing it. Makes me want to play some Explosive Arrow in the future. Maybe an Ignite base, maybe a different type of flat stacking. And then budget, can it be a starter? I do think Explosive Arrows, as we all know, definitely can be starters. A hit base still can be, but it tapers off unless you keep scaling gear which does take a bit of work, but definitely can be some starter material in certain directions, maybe more of an Ignite direction. And we are looking at a total of... It is too late in the day. Let's go from another perspective. 24. And with that, I think that's it. I think I did all the builds, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. I hope you guys enjoyed yet another league of build reviewing and another league of builds. Did 16 builds, I think, maybe 17. Could have been more if it wasn't for the starters that I kind of did as the event builds. They're just basic builds. But League of Kalandra League, sorry. I think it was a pretty good league overall. Well, it's going to be a controversial statement, but yes, I think it was a pretty good league. It was a good league mechanic that I enjoyed playing all the way through. I made a lot of really funky builds, as hopefully you could appreciate throughout the video. Did some pretty out of the box thinking. The meta was by no means established as far as I'm concerned. Still lots to do and still lots to discover. Yes, it had a rocky start. Arch Nemesis was kind of a pile of shit to begin with. It got better, and the lake mechanic got better as it went on. Ended up being a pretty good league. I do have higher hopes for the next one though. I really like the look of the league mechanic. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and the league, and just as hyped for the new league. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.